It was just a summer barbecue. Laughter, music, nothing unusual. But when she glanced over the rim of her glass and said, almost casually, "Come inside for ice," I didn't know I was about to step into the warmest, most disarming moment of my life. The first thing I remember about that evening was the smell of the grill drifting across the yard, smoky, sweet, and mixed with the scent of freshly cut grass. It was one of those early summer Saturdays when the light lingers a little longer than it should, the sky glowing like a soft watercolor just above the treetops. I had been invited by a college friend whose parents were hosting the neighborhood barbecue. I wasn't expecting anything more than an easy night. Paper plates, cheap beer, and music playing low from somebody's old speaker. I was halfway through a conversation about sports when I noticed her. She stood near the big wooden table where the salads and lemonade were lined up. She wasn't doing anything to draw attention. No loud laugh, no dramatic gesture. In fact, that's what made me look twice. She was listening to a neighbor talk about garden soil, but the way she tilted her head, the small crease at the corner of her smile, there was a steadiness about her that quietly drew the eye. Her hair was pinned up loosely, a few strands falling free around her temples. The late-day sunlight caught on them, making them glint like fine threads of bronze. She wore a light linen dress, nothing fancy, just soft blue with short sleeves. It moved slightly in the breeze as if it belonged to the day itself. I realized, with a faint embarrassment, that I was staring a little too long. I tried to look away, only to catch her glance sliding toward me at that exact moment. Her eyes didn't linger, just brushed past me. But the corners of her mouth tipped up as though she'd noticed and found it quietly amusing. It wasn't until later that we actually exchanged words. I had gone over to the table to refill my glass of lemonade, and she was there, reaching for the same ladle. Our hands nearly touched. Not quite, just close enough that I felt the space between us grow oddly vivid. "Careful," she said lightly, her voice low and warm. "This stuff's sweeter than it looks." I laughed and told her I'd probably regret it later, but that I liked it that way. For a moment, we were just two strangers standing by a bowl of lemonade while voices and music carried on behind us. Yet there was a tiny shift, a sort of unspoken awareness, as if the rest of the yard had faded back a step. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that didn't ask for more conversation. Then she turned to greet someone calling her name, and I stepped aside to let another guest pass. But as I walked back across the yard with my glass, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder to see where she'd gone. The evening unfolded in its usual easy rhythm. People eating off paper plates, kids chasing each other on the grass, the smell of grilled corn and burgers mingling with the cooling air. But for me, there was a subtle shift. I found myself more aware of the way the breeze carried the sound of her laughter across the lawn, or the way she rested her elbow lightly against the wooden table when she listened to someone talk. It wasn't dramatic. It was just the first spark, the quiet realization that among all the voices and faces that evening, hers had a gravity that kept drawing my attention back. By the time the sun had dipped behind the trees, the yard had taken on that familiar evening glow, citronella candles flickering on tables, voices softening as the night air cooled. I was leaning against the railing of the porch, listening absently to two guys argue about baseball, when I saw her again. She was by the drink cooler, tilting her head toward the empty ice bucket. With a faint shake of her head, she looked around as if deciding who might help. Her eyes found mine, not sharply, not with any force, but with a kind of quiet inevitability. She lifted her glass slightly, then smiled. "Would you give me a hand? Come inside for ice." It was the simplest request, almost casual, but something about it felt like stepping across a line I hadn't noticed before. I followed her up the back steps into the house. The door closed behind us with a soft click, and the hum of the party faded, replaced by the hush of a lived-in home. The kitchen lights glowed warm against polished wood cabinets, and the air smelled faintly of lemon soap and something floral I couldn't quite place. After the noise and smoke outside, it felt strangely intimate, as though we'd stumbled into a pause between moments. She moved with an ease that made the space feel smaller. Barefoot now, her steps were soundless against the tile. She opened the freezer door, leaned slightly, and then glanced back over her shoulder. "It always sticks," she said, tugging at the drawer. "Would you?" I stepped beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. My hand brushed hers lightly as I gripped the handle and pulled. The drawer gave with a sudden release, and a soft laugh escaped her lips. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying that same low steadiness as before. She reached in, her arm brushing lightly against mine as she scooped ice into a bowl. It was such a small contact, a passing touch, yet it sent a ripple of awareness through me, sharper than I expected. We stood there a moment longer than necessary, both of us holding the weight of silence. I could hear the muffled hum of voices through the window, but in here, it felt like time had slowed to a quieter rhythm. She glanced at me then, her expression unreadable but not distant. There was something in the way her eyes lingered, thoughtful, assessing, but with the faintest trace of amusement, as though she knew exactly how this moment might be remembered. Finally, she placed the scoop back and covered the bowl with a cloth. "That should keep everyone happy for a little while," she said lightly, as if dismissing the weight of the pause between us. But when she brushed past me to carry the bowl toward the door, her hand grazed the inside of my forearm. A touch so brief it could have been accidental, yet deliberate enough to leave a warmth trailing behind it. I followed her back outside, carrying nothing but the strange new awareness that something unspoken had shifted. The night air felt cooler when we stepped back out onto the porch. The sound of the party swelled up again. Bursts of laughter, the faint thump of music, the scrape of a chair being dragged across the deck. Nothing had changed, and yet it all felt slightly different, as if I were standing at the same party but now aware of some private undercurrent that no one else could see. She carried the bowl of ice easily, like it weighed nothing, and set it down on the drinks table. A couple of neighbors cheered as if she'd saved the evening, and she smiled with an ease that felt almost practiced. But I caught the quick glance she gave me over her shoulder, brief and unspoken, as if to acknowledge that we had shared a quiet moment apart from all this noise. I found myself watching her more closely than before, not staring, just noticing. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she leaned down to refill her glass. The way she laughed at someone's joke without throwing her head back, but with a softness that drew people in. We ended up near each other again by chance, standing close to the same wooden railing where a string of little white lights curled along the posts. The breeze coming off the lawn was cooler now, carrying the scent of the grill as the coals died down. She was talking with a man about local restaurants, but at some point her gaze drifted away from the conversation and found mine. It wasn't a long look, just long enough that I felt my pulse shift. Her eyes seemed to hold a quiet recognition, like she knew we were both aware of the moment we'd shared inside. When the conversation beside her moved on, she stepped a little nearer to where I stood. Not so close as to draw notice, but enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence. For a while we didn't speak. We just leaned on the railing, watching the party spill across the lawn. The kids chasing fireflies near the hedge, the older neighbors stacking empty plates. Finally, she said, almost to herself, "Nights like this make the summer feel slower somehow." I nodded. "Slower's good," I said. "Makes you notice the small things." That made her glance sideways at me, one corner of her mouth tipping up in that same quiet smile I'd seen earlier. A gust of breeze lifted a loose lock of her hair across her cheek. Without thinking, I reached out to gesture toward it. Not touching, just instinctively, and she tucked it back herself with a small, amused tilt of her head, as if she'd noticed the almost gesture. The sound of someone calling her name from across the yard broke the moment. She answered lightly and stepped away, but as she did, her arm brushed against mine, that same passing warmth I had felt in the kitchen. I stayed where I was for a long minute after she moved on, leaning on the railing as the party's hum filled the air again. I couldn't say what exactly had changed between us. It was too subtle to name, but I knew it was there. A shift in the space between two people, as tangible as the summer breeze moving through the strings of lights overhead. By the time the party had thinned out, the night had turned gentler. The music had faded to a soft background hum, and the kids had been carried home, leaving only a handful of neighbors talking lazily near the last of the glowing coals. The air smelled of ash and grass, and the porch light hummed quietly, drawing a few moths into its circle. I had drifted back to the porch steps with a bottle of water in hand, not quite ready to leave. The house behind us was dim now except for a single lamp glowing in the hallway. That was when she came up the steps, carrying a folded blanket over her arm. She hesitated for a moment, noticing me there in the half-light, then settled onto the porch rail a few feet away. "Thought you'd gone," she said with a small smile, her voice low, as if the night itself might be listening. I shook my head. Didn't feel like rushing off. Nights like this don't come often. For a few beats, we just listened to the quiet, punctuated by the faint scrape of someone stacking chairs on the lawn. The porch light cast a soft golden outline around her hair, which had loosened from its clip so that a few strands brushed her cheek. She tucked one behind her ear in a way that looked unpracticed, almost shy. She rested her hands on the folded blanket. "I always end up staying behind to help clean up," she said. "It's easier to enjoy the night after most of the noise is gone." There was something about the way she said it, a note of honesty that wasn't quite small talk. I nodded, then asked, "Do you like hosting these?" She laughed under her breath. "It's more that I like seeing everyone else relaxed. It reminds me that summer isn't slipping by as fast as it usually feels." The way she said it carried a weight I couldn't quite name. For the first time, I noticed a faint tiredness in her eyes, the kind that comes not from the evening but from years of carrying more than she lets on. It made her seem suddenly more real, more approachable. The porch light flickered briefly, and she shifted on the rail, drawing the blanket a little closer around her shoulders. I noticed the gesture and offered, "You're cold. Just the breeze," she said. But when I hesitated, she gave a tiny nod, and I held the other end of the blanket so that together we spread it across her lap. My fingers brushed the back of her hand, a soft, unintentional touch that lingered for the briefest second. Neither of us commented on it, but the silence that followed felt warmer. We sat there side by side, wrapped in the easy stillness of the late hour, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn. There was no rush in her presence, no need for words to fill the quiet. "At some point," she said softly, "it's nice having someone who doesn't mind the quiet." I looked at her then, catching the faint smile that reached her eyes. "Sometimes the quiet says more," I answered. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she shifted slightly so her shoulder rested just a little nearer to mine. Not quite leaning, just close enough to feel the shared warmth in the cool night air. In that small, unhurried moment beneath the porch light, the distance between us seemed to shrink without either of us taking a step. The yard had emptied almost completely by the time we moved from the porch steps to the lawn. Someone had left behind a lantern on the picnic table, its light flickering softly in the breeze, casting uneven shadows across the grass. The night felt larger now, quieter, yet somehow more intimate. The low hum of distant crickets filled the spaces where laughter and music had been. She carried 2 mugs of tea she'd brewed in the kitchen and handed one to me with a small, almost absent smile. Her fingers brushed mine briefly as I took it, and even that simple warmth felt more personal in the hush of the late hour. We found a spot near the garden edge where the ground was still warm from the day's sun and sat down side by side. The sky above was wide and open, scattered with stars. A faint scent of lavender drifted from the nearby flower beds, mixing with the earthy coolness of the soil. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet didn't feel awkward. It was the kind that invited you to listen, to the night, to your own thoughts. She cradled her mug in both hands and watched the steam curl up into the cool air. "You ever notice," she said softly at last, "how summer nights feel borrowed? Like they're on loan, and you have to use them well before they slip away." I glanced at her profile in the lantern's glow. There was a gentleness in her expression, but also something else. A trace of longing that made her seem suddenly more human, less untouchable. "I know what you mean," I said. "It's like you blink and the season's gone." She nodded, her eyes still on the sky. "When you're younger, you think there's endless time. Later, You start realizing you don't get as many of these nights as you'd like. The way she said it, quietly, without drama, felt more intimate than if she'd shared some grand confession. I hesitated before speaking, then asked lightly, "Is that why you host these barbecues? To hold on to the summers a little longer?" That brought a small, wistful smile to her lips. Maybe. Or maybe it's just an excuse to gather people. Life gets quieter than you expect sometimes. The words lingered between us. I sensed there was more beneath them. Stories she wasn't telling, years she carried with grace, but also with a hint of solitude. I shifted slightly, resting one hand on the grass beside me. "I don't think I've ever thought of quiet as a bad thing," I said. "Sometimes it's where you actually hear yourself." She looked at me then, as if weighing the truth of that. Her gaze held mine longer than before, steady, thoughtful. The breeze stirred again, carrying a coolness that made her draw the blanket a little tighter around her shoulders. I adjusted it for her, letting my fingers graze the edge near her arm. The touch was nothing more than practical, yet I felt the air between us thicken in the silence that followed. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice softer now. We didn't move closer, but the space between us felt smaller, as if the quiet night had drawn us into the same rhythm. Two people sitting side by side, aware of each other not just as strangers at a party, but as something else. Above us, the stars shimmered faintly, scattered like distant lanterns across the sky. I found myself wondering if, years from now, I'd remember this exact scene. The stillness of the lawn, the warmth of her presence in the cool air, and the feeling that we'd both let a little piece of ourselves be seen. The night had deepened into that hushed hour when even the crickets seemed to slow their rhythm. The lantern on the picnic table had burned low, leaving only a faint amber glow that barely reached the edges of the yard. Most of the house was dark now. Only a single porch light hummed softly, its glow spilling across the steps where we'd first sat. We had stayed out in the garden longer than either of us intended. Our tea had gone cold, and we were speaking less. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the pauses between our words had grown comfortable. There was something in the way the quiet wrapped around us, a sense that the night itself was listening. She shifted slightly, drawing the blanket closer, and let out a breath that sounded almost like a sigh. "I should probably start bringing things in," she said, though she didn't move. Her tone carried the same unhurried softness that had marked the evening, as if neither of us really wanted to break the spell. I glanced at her, catching the way the porch light outlined her profile, the gentle curve of her cheek, the calm steadiness in her eyes. "I can help," I offered, though I didn't move either. For a few moments we stayed like that, caught in the stillness. Then, as if something unspoken had nudged her, she turned slightly toward me, her hands folded loosely around the edge of the blanket. "It's strange," she said quietly. "You spend years thinking you have everything figured out, and then you find yourself surprised by people. By moments like this." Her words settled into the night air, unhurried, like leaves drifting down into water. I felt the weight of them, not heavy, but significant, and found myself answering without overthinking. "Maybe that's the best part, that you can still be surprised." Her eyes met mine then. The look wasn't intense or searching. It was quieter, steadier, as if she were seeing me for the first time in a way that mattered. A breeze slipped across the garden, carrying the scent of damp soil and the faint sweetness of the lavender beds. She shifted the blanket slightly and, without seeming to think about it, let one side fall gently across my shoulder. The gesture was so simple, yet it closed the last inch of space between us. Our arms brushed, lightly at first, then settled into the small shared warmth beneath the fabric. I could feel the faint, steady rhythm of her breathing beside me. For a heartbeat, neither of us looked away. The quiet stretched thin and luminous, the kind of silence that feels fuller than any words. I noticed the way her eyes softened at the edges, the way her fingers rested lightly on the blanket as if unsure whether to move. I didn't reach out. I only shifted slightly so that my shoulder rested more fully against hers. The contact was warm, grounding, and somehow more intimate for being so unhurried. She let out a breath, not quite a sigh, and said softly, It's been a long time since I've sat like this. Just still. Me too, I said, my voice low. Feels like the kind of moment you don't want to rush. At that, she smiled, small, genuine, the kind that lingers even after the lips stop moving. For a while longer, we sat beneath the dim glow of the porch light, wrapped in the shared quiet of the night. There was no need for more than that, no dramatic gesture, no hurried words. The closeness itself, the warmth of her shoulder against mine and the soft hush around us, felt like the peak of something that had been building quietly all evening. By the time we finally stood, the garden was dark except for the single lantern by the steps. The night had settled into that deep, steady stillness that comes just before dawn. The party was long over. Even the hum of the porch light felt softer now, as if the whole world had lowered its voice. She brushed a few crumbs from the blanket as we folded it together. Our hands met briefly at the center of the fabric. A simple, practical touch, but neither of us rushed to pull away. There was a calmness in the way we moved, as though we both wanted to hold on to the small, quiet rhythm we'd found sitting side by side under the stars. We carried the last of the dishes into the kitchen. The house felt different now. The hallway lamp cast a warm pool of light on the hardwood floor, and the faint smell of lemon soap lingered in the cool air. She set the dishes in the sink and rinsed her hands, then reached for a towel. For a moment, she stood with her back to me, her shoulders relaxed, the small movements of someone at ease in her own home. "Thanks for staying to help," she said without turning, her voice low but carrying that same steadiness I'd grown to recognize in her. I leaned against the counter, watching the way the soft light caught in her hair. "Didn't feel like something to rush through," I said. Besides, I liked the quiet that made her glance over her shoulder with a faint, wry smile. Not everyone likes the quiet. Most people feel the need to fill it. "Maybe that's why tonight felt different," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer, her expression thoughtful, then nodded slightly as if in agreement. We moved back to the porch for a last look at the yard. The grass glistened faintly under the moonlight, and the chairs stood in small clusters like patient silhouettes waiting for the next gathering. I realized how rare it was to share a night that left no demand, no expectation. Just a sense of something unspoken but understood. "I should probably let you get home," she said at last, her voice gentle, as if she, too, felt reluctant to end the evening. I nodded, though I stayed where I was a heartbeat longer. "Yeah," I said, "but I'm glad I stayed as long as I did." We stepped closer to the porch steps, where the night breeze was cooler. She reached out, almost without thinking, and rested a hand lightly against my arm. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just a quiet, steady touch that felt like a bridge between words left unsaid. "Good night," she said, her voice softer now. "Good night," I echoed. For a moment, we stood in the hush between parting and holding on. Then she let her hand fall back gently, and I stepped down from the porch. I glanced back once as I reached the gate. She was still standing there beneath the porch light, arms loosely folded, watching with a small, thoughtful smile that made the night feel somehow unfinished, yet whole. As I walked down the quiet street, I felt the warmth of that last look linger with me. Not as a promise, not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. It was the kind of moment that stays with you, not for its grandness, but for its softness. The quiet certainty that sometimes the most lasting connections are the ones that grow in the stillness, one summer night at a time. If this story stayed with you, the way quiet summer nights sometimes do, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more slow burn romance tales. Share it with someone who believes in the power of unspoken moments.